Hello, and welcome to another Joe and Cat Chats.
Oh boy. Yes,
Yeah,
ma'am.
today we're talking about language.
If we are talking about language. And before we start talking language, the most important question that I got to ask you, Miss Wells, is how are you doing? Please let me
Oh, I am doing really well. Life is just moving fast for me these days. So
know.
lots of
Mhm,
stuff going on, keeping myself busy as always. So,
mhm,
but things are good. How about
mhm.
yourself, Joe? How are
You know
you?
what? I'm staying out of the way. I'm keeping my head to the sky, like Earth, Wind, and Fire once said, and I'm just staying hydrated and moisturized. And as
Perfect.
the weather gets cooler, I can't be out here on the streets looking dusty. I got to be looking fresh and clean. So that's my focus right now, and that's my story, and I'm going to stick with that story.
That's great. I love it.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
yeah, so today we're talking about language,
Yes,
and
we are.
I'm really excited for this episode because, I mean, it's sort of one of those things that we've kind of talked about before, kind of not though. It seems kind of like out of left field for a topic for us on the
It
Joe and
is,
Cat Chats.
of course.
But I think that the cool thing is that we are going to sort of weave it into the topics that we've already discussed before,
Absolutely.
and sort of see how they relate to things like colonialism and things like capitalism that we've talked about in the last few weeks.
Correct.
So,
Correct. Correct.
yeah.
And given the election cycle that we have coming up right now, and given all of the political rhetoric that has been bandied about on mainstream media and on and through what is called the fifth estate, the internet, so much of what's happening right now is based on communication and the way we are being communicated to and the way we communicate with each other on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour, minute-to-minute, second-to-second basis is absolutely important. And so much of what we're talking about involves words, and the words that we use. The words that we use have the power to heal, they have the power to help, they have the power to harm, they have the power to heal. They can help us. They can make us better people than we already are. Or the words that we use can disintegrate ourselves or someone else into something that they never thought they would ever be before, and take them to a place that they never imagined they would want to be, either negatively or positively. So ideally, the whole ethos, the umbrella that hangs over the Joe and Cat Chats enterprise is to uplift people, is to make
Mhm.
people better after watching each of our episodes. And we urge each of you to just binge watch us. If you're not going to binge watch The Wire or just binge watch us, please, because you watch 16 or 17 or 18 episodes of us and you're like, damn, you know what? I didn't know that, but I'm happy I did learn from Kat and Joe. This is really interesting stuff. I'm going to keep watching them or keep listening to them or both. So
Totally.
that's the whole reason why we today we wanted to focus on language, because again, we talked about imperialism and colonialism and how in colonial times, not the colonial times that actually ended, but in colonial times, you had indigenous people that were forced to indoctrinate other people's languages.
Mhm.
But then we talked about that, but we didn't actually define what language actually is. And then we never really talked about all of the other pieces and parts that go along with language. So we're going to dive deep into this today. Today's episode is going to be, in my opinion, it's going to be a bit more academic than a
Mhm.
lot of our previous episodes. There's going to be a lot of terminology that we're going to throw out to you. We will make sure that we put the definitions for much of this terminology in the notes when we type up the narratives. And I'll make sure I put some notes when I put this up on my YouTube channel, Joe Nice DJ, the YouTube channel. And we're going to give everybody a little bit different of an education today with this particular episode number 19
Mhm.
of the Joe and Cat Chat series.
Yeah, and the nice thing is these are recorded, so you can always go back if you miss something or are unsure. So
Mm-hmm.
I do encourage people to do that, given that we are going to kind of go over a bunch of stuff.
Absolutely.
Um, but yeah, why don't we get into it? So, Joe, what is language? What is it even?
Language. Well, people say, oh, you speak a different language, or what's your language? what I just did there is an example of something else we'll talk about later on in the show. But language is a structured system of human communication. It's a structured system of human communication. Usually that communication takes place two ways, either spoken with words or spoken with sound actually, or written with words. Now, there's a whole science of studying language, and that science has a particular terminology. It's called linguistics. Linguistics is the scientific study of language. Now, part of the reason why people have a language and part of the reason why people study the science behind languages, linguistics, is so people can communicate. Now, you're probably like, well, Joe, please tell us, what exactly is communication? Communication is the transfer of meaning and understanding of meaning between a sender and a recipient. I'm going to say that again. Communication is the transfer of meaning and understanding of meaning between a sender and a recipient. Now, you're probably like, well, Joe, how do people actually communicate? Because there's a lot of different ways people could communicate. We're communicating right now, but other people communicate in other ways. There are 4 types of communication. You have verbal, you have nonverbal, you have written, and then you have visual. So there's 4 types of communication. So I hope the last 90 seconds or so really sets the foundation for what we're really going to dive into about language, because I promise you, everybody, it's going to get a little bit deeper once we really dive into some more of these terminologies. And some of the terminologies we're going to define, you would think, well, I know what that means, but there's actually real proper definitions for these things. And it'll all make sense when we put all the pieces together.
Yeah, totally. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. Me too. Me too. Me too. Now, when I said earlier on when I defined language, when I said language is a system of communication between a structured system of human communication done either verbally or written. And then I said sound. Let's define what a sound is. Okay. A sound is a vibration that travels through the air that's received by another entity. So again, that goes back to communication, where it's a transfer of meaning and understanding of meaning between a sender and a recipient. So I send out a sound. Someone else has to get it someone else has to receive it.
Yeah.
Right? And if you don't receive it, how do we know it happened? There's no evidence of it happening. So you have to send it out. You have to send out that signal. And that signal, for the purposes of this conversation, it's verbal, written, but again, you have nonverbal signals and you have visual signals. Now, when we speak or write, we use letters that are arranged together in particular groupings. And those letters that are arranged in particular groups that have distinct individual meaning are called words. They're called words. And those words are a collection of sounds, typically in some sort of symbolic representation, letters, or letters, because they technically wouldn't be words if they're numbers, because they're numbers, but even the numbers have words that define what the numbers are. Yeah. But it's a small collection of sounds that are grouped together to convey some sort of meaning. So I just defined what a word is. A word is literally 4 separate sounds put together that defines that single utterance that has a specific meaning. Now, when you put a bunch of words together, one after one, it could be 2 words, it could be 5 words, it could be 13 words with different punctuation marks. That is called a sentence. And a sentence is 1 or more words that has some sort of grammatical connection, where there is a subject, for the most part, there is a predicate or a verb, and then you have certain modifiers that are attached to the subject and predicate. Most often adverbs, adjectives, direct objects, indirect objects, prepositional phrases, adverbial phrases, adjectival phrases, etc. So when you attach all of these pieces together, the foundation of your sentence is going to be the subject and the predicate. Who's doing the action and what action was actually taking place. But then everything else that attaches to that all are component parts of the sentence. And each component part of the sentence is made up of smaller parts called words. Now, you just can't randomly put together a sentence because it's like, well, yeah, I feel like saying cat hill jumped over fence. It's like, what does that mean? That doesn't make any sense. So, or you're wearing a black shirt, or in English, normally we would say cat is wearing a black shirt. But not abnormally, you wouldn't say cat is wearing a shirt black. Okay? The rules that we have set up for sentence structure and the rules that govern language and the way sentences are put together, that is called syntax. Syntax. So, cat, you have a black shirt. All right? In English, the adjective comes before the noun. Black is the adjective, shirt is the noun. In Spanish, it's the opposite. You would say camisa negra, shirt, black. In French, what would it be in French? It's chemise noire.
Yeah, I was going to say it's the same in French because French and Spanish are similar. Yeah,
exactly.
Chemise noire.
Exactly.
Yeah,
chemise noire. You have a large black dog named Onus.
I do.
Okay? You have a dog named Onus. Black dog. In Spanish, perro negro. In French, chien noir. You see? So syntax is important based upon the language that you speak. And the language that you speak will determine the syntax of your particular sentence structure. I'm sure there are in some languages where you might have the noun dog, but you'll have the adjective in a completely different part of the sentence, not in close proximity, either preceding or after the noun itself. The adjective might be in a completely different part of the sentence, and then because that's the way that particular language and that syntax for that particular language has been adopted. So it's important to make sure that we understand what syntax actually is, because the syntax also allows us to have meaning with each of our sentences that we have. And another linguistic term that we're going to discuss for a little bit is semantics. And semantics is the study of meaning. It's like, well, wait, what does this mean? What are we actually saying here when we talk about a black dog or a black shirt or a red pair of pants? What are we talking about? So, Kat, I'm sure you're familiar with a gentleman, a scholar, one of the greatest scholars of our lifetime, or really any lifetime, named Noam Chomsky. Okay, I'm sure we're all familiar with him.
Yeah.
Professor Chomsky, back in 1957, came up with this sentence. He said, "Colorless green ideas sleep furiously." Okay, and I'm going to say that again just in case everybody's taking notes. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Now, if we think about everything that I just talked about for the past 7 or 8 minutes, I talked about grammar, I talked about syntax, I talked about semantics, I talked about a sentence, because colorless green ideas sleep furiously is absolutely a sentence. The beauty of that sentence is grammatically or syntactically, it's absolutely correct. It's perfect. It's adjective, adjective, noun, verb, adverb. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Semantically, that sentence makes no sense at all. Absolutely no sentence at all. So the whole purpose of that sentence, which eventually I think became his PhD thesis and eventually a book, is that you can have a sentence that's grammatically correct, but makes absolutely no sense. Because think about it. How could something be colorless and green at the same time? Do ideas have a color? And do you put ideas to sleep? No, because the whole idea of an idea is to give birth to a new idea. You don't put an idea to sleep. And sleep is a place where you rest, you get your nap, it's a peaceful place. You can't be in a peaceful place and be furious at the same time. So what he did with that sentence is absolutely brilliant, because he was able to show the complete illogicalness, if that's even a word, of that sentence, but yet structurally the sentence is sound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, English is such an interesting language because there's so many exceptions. And I totally appreciate you going through all of those things, because it is important to remember that these things build upon each other, and you can't necessarily take one away and still have it make sense. And so it is such an interesting thing, the way we communicate and use language. I know primarily English is our language that we speak,
Absolutely.
but yeah, it's so interesting to sort of be able to think about other languages too that are structured differently, and how that impacts like the difficulty in how we learn it, for example, or things like that. Because I've tried to learn other languages with not much success, but like I know a little bit of French and Spanish, so
yeah. And this kind of piggybacks to our conversation last week when we talked about refugees coming into the United States, or refugees being repatriated to a third party country. Typically with repatriation, where these countries, the countries where refugees are typically coming from, they're not necessarily going to countries where their mother tongue is going to be present in that new country. So in addition to potentially having a low literacy rate in your mother tongue, or what's called your A language in the field of linguistics and interpreting and translation, you then have to learn another language. And those language learning deficiencies become significantly more apparent when you potentially have to learn a language that uses different symbols or a different alphabet. So last week I spoke significantly about Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Syria. Those three languages all use different alphabets. They're using different alphabets. Syrians using Arabic. I'm fairly certain that Ethiopia and Eritrea, they have their own alphabet. And I don't remember exactly what the name of that alphabet is. But let's say you're going to get repatriated to Denmark. You now have to learn a Roman language-based alphabet.
Yeah.
That's completely different than learning these different symbols and shapes that form words in your language. And then with Arabic, for example, the sentence structure is different. And now you're going from a one sentence structure that you've learned all your life that's been Arabic to a completely different sentence structure in Danish, or a completely different sentence structure again in English. So this is part of the reason why language learning becomes difficult, I guess, as you get older, because you're used to certain linguistic speaking and reading patterns, and these patterns form these neural synapses in your brain that become very difficult to break, because you're so used to the habits of speaking a certain way, or speaking in a certain tone of voice, or with a certain accent, or with a certain inflection. And now that all changes because you're now speaking a different language, and you have to learn different sentence structure, different syntax, a different language, and potentially a different way of writing the symbols that make up words and the words that make up sentences, so you can be understood with somebody else.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and that's interesting. One thing that I sort of noticed you mention is I almost forgot for a moment, because I take it for granted because English is my first language, but the alphabet is Roman. And we talked about colonialism a few episodes ago. And so that's another demonstration of how sort of prevalent colonialism is, because there have been many iterations of it, colonialism and imperialism, of course.
Absolutely.
And so it's really interesting that we're using a Roman alphabet, but English is sort of the one language that has become the one that everybody sort of tries to learn in one way or another, because business is often done in English.
Yes, correct.
For many other reasons as well.
Of course.
But yeah, there's like, there's the connection, I guess, one of them to language and sort of the globalized world we live in, which is globalized because of colonialism.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. If quite honestly, if the United States has what, 320, 330 million people, but there's a lot more people than that speak English. But I think the most widely spoken language in the world is either Chinese or Arabic. Quite honestly, and again, America, we're such an ethnocentric country and becoming more xenophobic as the days continue on. What I would love, something we talked about in our education episode of the magnificent Joe and Cat Chat series, we talked about in education, we talked about language learning. We were like, you know what? We should be learning other languages. We should be learning how to speak with other people from other countries. Now, granted, would it make sense to learn some obscure language that 5,000 people speak? Probably not. But would it be good to learn a little bit of Spanish? Sure. Would it be good to know some French? I think so. Would it be helpful to know some German, especially traveling through Europe? Absolutely. I would argue that if you're traveling through Europe, you would probably be better served learning German instead of French, because there's more, I think there are more people who speak German in Europe than French. French is only the official language in one country. German is the official language in at least 2 countries. It's the official language in Austria, and it is the official language in Germany. Now, there are some parts of Switzerland that speak German. There are obviously some parts of Switzerland, especially the western portion of Switzerland, that speak French. But even the German that is spoken in Switzerland is Swiss German. It's slightly different than your actual standard issue German. But there are parts of, let me think, there are parts of Belgium, anything kind of south of Brussels, it's entirely French. It's entirely French. But then anything kind of north of Brussels, it's going to be a mixture of Flemish and Dutch. You might get a little bit of French here and there, but it's mostly Flemish and Dutch. So you'll be better, quite honestly, if you're traveling through Europe, you're better off learning German than French. But that's just my recommendation. That's just my opinion. I've kind of been around Europe a little bit. So there's that.
Yeah.
There's
that. That's interesting how, again, sort of reminding me of the conversations we've had before, just sort of that language doesn't have the same political borders as the countries, so that's an interesting sort of cultural thing too, because these places are just occupied by people that have just always spoken a particular language. Yes, of course, they've learned others over the years, but often if a town is full of people that haven't really ever moved around or whatever, and haven't needed to learn a new language, then that's just sort of the way it goes, and it supersedes the political borders for sure.
You know what? But it's interesting you mentioned the political borders of language, because I want to bring up an example where language actually was used to influence politics in a particular instance. This might be a bit before your time. This was actually when I was a youngster, a young youngster. In 1982, there was a military conflict in Argentina. And at the very tip of Argentina, almost kind of on the way to Antarctica, there are some islands called the Falkland Islands. And the British was like, yo, we want those islands. And the people of Argentina were like, we're not giving these islands to you. So there was a conflict. Now, depending on which language you spoke, it would determine kind of the political lean or spin or support for which country you wanted to support. So England, they were just saying Falkland Islands. In Argentina, I'm trying to remember, it was Islas, Malvinas, that's what it was. Islas Malvinas, Falkland Islands. So it was like, well, wait a minute, if you're saying Islas Malvinas, are you supporting the Argentinian side of the conflict, or are you supporting the British side of the conflict? And then if you said Falkland Islands, are you supporting the British side of the conflict or the Argentinian side of the conflict? So there is an example where language can create these imaginary, perceived, or in some cases, real boundaries geopolitically.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a good thing that you brought up because that happens today still. It's not like the political borders have no influence and language has no influence. I mean, the same thing could be said with the Israel's Palestine conflict. It's used politically, and depending on
Yes.
how you frame things, that
Hmm.
is absolutely a political thing. Using the language that we have for those two countries, the regions, how we construct our sentences around uh, you know those people and the
Exactly.
conflict involved, and it happens
Exactly.
all over the place in every instance. I mean,
Hmm.
even in the US election, that's an ongoing thing right now. There's ways to construct the way you communicate in
Right.
order to influence your followers,
Correct.
whatever side you're on, and so it's very powerful.
Words are powerful. Just like I said
Yeah.
earlier, words have the power to harm, they have the power to heal, they have the
Hmm.
power to hurt, they have the power to help.
Yeah.
And the words that we use, and the example of the Islas Malvinas or the Falkland Islands, it's depending on where you lie politically, depends on another concept, which we're going to talk about a little bit now, which is called interpreting.
Hmm.
Now you're like, well, Joe, what's interpreting? Interpreting is spoken communication between different language users, and it uses a cyclical process of receiving a signal, decoding a signal, and recoding a signal. Okay? And I'm going to say that again. It's spoken communication. So spoken meaning sound. Receive, decode, recode. Receive, decode, recode. Now, there are, as a slight aside, but it has relevance to what we were talking about. There are three ways to interpret. Okay? There are three ways to interpret. You can interpret interlingually between languages. You can interpret interculturally between cultures, or, and get ready for this word, you can interpret intersemiotically.
Mm.
So you're like, well, Joe, what does it mean to interpret intersemiotically? A perfect example of interpreting intersemiotically is Braille.
Yeah.
Braille, where you're not using spoken word and you're not using words that you can read, and it's not anything cultural because it's raised bumps on a piece of paper. But the symbols that you feel are representative of particular characters that you put together to make up those individual utterances that have meaning, which we
Mm.
defined earlier on about 20 minutes ago. We called them words. So that is intersemiotic interpreting. If you've ever been on a boat and you have those flags and you see the people using those flags that have different shapes and they're held in different positions, it's called
Mhm.
semaphore.
Mm.
Semaphore is an example of intersemiotics, where you're using flags in different hand positions to convey particular symbols grouped together to form words, so you can convey a message to the recipient, who can then receive that message, decode those hand signals,
Mhm.
put that code together, decipher that code, and recode it in a way that the recipient can understand those signals that are being communicated to that other
Mm.
person. So um, SOS signaling, if you're on a
Mhm.
boat, where you flash the lights, that's another way. Or you have use an SOS Morse code is another example of
Mhm.
intersemiotic communication. So you can interpret interlingually, interculturally, or intersemiotically. Now, what I'm going to say next might sound like I'm repeating myself, but it's actually quite different. There are different modes of interpreting. There are different
Mm.
modes of interpreting. And these modes of interpreting, let me go back one more second. I completely forgot a major part of intersemiotic communication. Another form of intersemiotics is sign language.
Yes, for sure.
Sign language. Sign language. So this means I love you, but you have to know the symbology behind this. So the person that understands American Sign Language, whatever kind of sign language, knows that this means I love you. So intersemiotics again. Now there's several different types of interpreting. You can have what's called simultaneous interpreting, where you're in a booth, it's typically the type of interpreting that's done at a conference. One of my former professors at Wake Forest University was a conference interpreter for the United Nations for 15 years. And she knew a whole lot and was doing simultaneous interpreting in a variety of strength, or Slovenian to Spanish. It'd be like these complete strange. And what happens is when you're doing this type of simultaneous interpreting, there's no time to think about if the translation is correct or not. So you're listening, you got the headphones on, and you're like, okay, somebody's saying this in this language, I'm listening and I'm speaking it into this language. Mm-hmm. It's not exactly the same time, but it's close enough. There's another type of interpreting called consecutive interpreting, where you'll have somebody speak for about a minute or 2 minutes, and then the interpreter will go ahead and summarize the last minute or 2 minutes of what that other person said. There's escort interpreting, where you typically see this when you're doing traveling. I have a very good friend of mine who lives in Sarajevo who did this kind of work for a while. He was a tour guide. And being a tour guide is a perfect example of escort interpreting, where you're walking around and you're like, okay, well, hey, you're seeing this, but then you're speaking in that other person's native language, or a language they understand, which may not necessarily be their or native language. And they're not only speaking to them, but they're also being a cultural broker. They're saying, hey, look, it's not just these words, but here's how these words fit into this particular culture. There's a couple other types of interpreting. There's another type of interpreting called whisper interpreting. Typically, whisper interpreting is also known by the French word called chuchotage. And typically it's when you have somebody, it's similar to simultaneous interpreting, where simultaneous interpreting, you're in a booth and you have the headset on, you're listening. But whisper interpreting, you're actually standing next to or behind the person or sitting next to the person, and you're hearing what the person is saying in that source language, and you, the interpreter, is receiving that signal, decoding that signal, and recoding that signal to the person you are interpreting for. Mm-hmm. So that's whisper interpreting. There's two other types that I want to outline. There's one called remote interpreting. You typically see that over video or phone. That's rather self-explanatory. The other type of interpreting is called sight translation. Sight translation. And that's when you say, hey, you know what? I've got a book and it's in French, and I'm going to read this book, and while I'm reading, interpret what I'm reading from French to English. That sight translation is the most difficult type of interpreting, because while you're reading, you're reading in French, but speaking in another language. Mm-hmm. Sight translation is the most difficult. And so again, there's many types of interpreting. Now, you're probably like, well, wait a minute, Joe, you hear the word interpretation often substituted for interpreting. And technically that's not right. I actually said this in one of the Instagram story videos I did the other day. I was like, you know what, there's two separate terms, interpreting and interpretation. We already defined interpreting as receive, decode, recode of signals between a sender and a recipient who use two different languages. Interpretation is a subjective opinion about an abstract concept. Mm-hmm. So I'm wearing a Marvin Gaye shirt. It says, what's going on? I think Marvin Gaye is the greatest R&B singer of all time. Someone else might like, you know what? I don't really like Marvin. I like Marvin Gaye, but I prefer Luther Vandross, which wouldn't necessarily be a bad choice, but to each his or her own. You might go to the Louvre and be like, you know what? The Mona Lisa is ugly as shit. Then you might be like, you know what? I really like that sort of resting bitch face she has. She's like, just not really doing a whole lot. You might like that. My daughter thinks I'm the most handsome guy she's ever met. There might be somebody in the grocery store that might think I'm as ugly as a bowling shoe. That's their interpretation. So, I mean, if there's somebody at the grocery store that does think I'm as ugly as a bowling shoe, that really would be wrong.
Right?
Dude, come on. I mean, what are we dealing with here? But
Right.
you get what I'm saying, though.
Yeah.
It's so interpretation is often confused for interpreting. When we
Mm-hmm.
were talking about language and linguistics, the word we should be using is interpreting, not interpretation. Because there's, yes, there is some subjectivity about language, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. But when we're talking about interpreting, what we're trying to do is make sure that the process of receiving, decoding, and recoding spoken words or written words, which will be translation. And translation is essentially the same thing as saying we're just looking at words, written words rather than spoken words. But it's essentially the same sort of concept of looking at a signal, the signal in this instance being a word, decoding that signal, and then recoding that signal. But at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, maintaining, to borrow a phrase from one of my professors, Dr. Rosenberg, he said to maintain the same sort of flavor from the source language to the target language. Because sometimes there are instances where you might do a direct translation or a literal translation, but the literal translation may not actually make sense.
Mm.
So you'll have to do some other measures to try to convey that sort of meaning. One of those measures might be to do what's called a modulation. Now, I totally wasn't going to talk about this, but I might as well bring it up. So for example, there might be a language where you'll say, the weather is cool outside.
Mm-hmm.
But the word cool might not exist in that particular language. So the modulation would be the opposite frame of that particular adjective. So instead of cool, you might say it's not hot outside.
Right.
That's a modulation. So, so again, if you were to do a literal translation of that particular concept in that target language, the literal translation in that target language might not convey the meaning you actually wanted to have happen. But going from it's cool outside in the source language to it's not hot outside in the target language conveys the meaning.
Right.
But there are some instances in a literal translation, if you go literal word for word, the target language might not convey the meaning that you wanted to have in the source language. And in that instance, to correct those sorts of translational errors, you do what's called a back translation, where you take the words that from the literal translation, you're like, okay, well, hey, what did I have here? Oh, it actually wasn't this. Let me fix this translation.
Those are very funny to look up on Google. Lots of people have like YouTube
Bingo.
videos of them like doing those
Yep.
back translations.
Yep. That's exactly it.
Yeah. So one thing that I sort of wanted to bring up just as an aside here, because we are talking about interpreting and then also interpretation,
Yes.
is when I was looking up intercultural interpreting, it sort of prompted me to be the definition that I came up with or looked into, prompted me to sort of think about cultural relativism,
Mm-hmm.
because your so it deals with a sense of like compartmentalization of your own culture in
Yes.
order to sort of learn about another culture or convey a message from another culture using
Perfect.
meaning. And things mean different things, like you were just saying, in different cultures and different
Absolutely.
places. And so all of this is so interesting to learn about, or to talk about, I guess, to really, I guess, unpack the cultural stuff behind this, because cultural relativism is when you are, I guess, like making a cultural assumption about something that's unknown to you,
Yes.
that you're trying not to judge, but you might be judging, or you might be making your interpretation of it so culturally different from your own that you're not problematizing things that are problematic. So there's sort of a couple of ways you can risk falling into cultural relativism. And so I think that's just something that I wanted to add in as an interesting aspect of how this could play out or not, because language is so fluid.
Language is fluid. And another part of cultural relativism that absolutely is kind of connected to all that is cultural competency. And
Yeah.
so much of what we talk about in terms of anti-racism work is, and quite honestly, intersectionality is rooted in cultural competency. Because, one of the examples we'll talk about later is when you're talking about Black people or white people in terms of the racial categorization of people, you use a capital letter. You don't, because the lowercase letter is representative of a color on the color spectrum, but the capitalized letter is representative of the racial designation, or as Dr. David Lee once said, the biological social relevance with human fatal social consequences. So so that's another way that language can be somewhat ambiguous. And we use the capitalized letter when we're talking about racial categorization to avoid potential double meaning of this, of particular, within particular sentences. Now, that sort of double meaning, or what's called a double entendre, has a specific linguistic term, and it's called polysemics. And polysemics is when you have a word that has multiple meanings. Now, two examples of words that have high polysemic value are run and set. So, one of my favorite clubs in the world just closed yesterday. It's a club called U Street Music Hall in Washington, D.C. They had a good 10-year run. I woke up at 6:30 this morning and went for a morning run. The lady on the bus next to me had a run in her sweater. My refrigerator is running. My nose is running. My car is running. The ball is running down or running downhill or whatever. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There's so many different ways you could use the word run. And it's like, well, wow, how could one word have all these multiple definitions? I played a great set at Bass Coast Music Festival 2 years ago. The tennis match is in the third set. My daughter bought a new play set yesterday. I have to go set up the bookcase tonight.
Totally. Oh my gosh.
So many different ways the word set can be used. And I just thought of these like right off the top of my head. But there's loads of different ways you can use the word set and loads of different ways you can use the word run or running or setting. So again, that sort of double meaning in those particular words and other words creates a lot of confusion when you're trying to communicate with people. Now, and I just use those particular words individually and then attach them to other words to make sentences. Now, there's a linguistic concept, and we're going to get a little bit deeper here. There's a linguistic concept called lexical ambiguity. Lexical ambiguity. And lexical ambiguity happens when you have a particular word in a sentence that completely changes the meaning of the sentence. So you have this happen a lot with jokes. You have it happen sometimes with puns. But let's say I were to throw a Frisbee at you. Okay? Typically, you would either try to catch it, or what would you do?
Get out of the way.
Or
duck.
Perfect. That's the word I was hoping you would use. Duck. Okay? So if someone were to ask me, hey, did you see Catherine duck? I would say, yeah, I saw her duck. I saw her duck. Now,
quack, quack.
See where I'm going with this?
Totally.
Now, if we didn't put together the whole narrative behind it of me throwing the Frisbee at you and you not being able to catch it, so you ducked, and I said, I saw her duck, that could mean you have a pet duck in your apartment. And yeah, I saw her duck. Yeah, had it on a leash, walking around, feeding her breadcrumbs. Yeah, I saw her duck. But the word duck in that sentence is somewhat ambiguous. I was like, well, wait a minute, did she move out of the way to avoid being hit by a Frisbee? Or is it this bird that's white that has a bill and goes quack, quack? What does she mean by duck? So that's lexical ambiguity. Let's say me, you, gosh, a couple of your friends, maybe my daughter might show up. No, she's 9, so she probably can't, no, it's too late for her to stay up at midnight. But let's say this sentence, without any context, they passed the port at midnight. What do you think that means?
Ooh, okay. I live on a lake, or beside a lake, so there's a port on the lake, but that's also a beverage.
Perfect. That's exactly my point.
Yeah.
So this could be, hey, we're on a boat and we passed the port, like the harbor,
Yeah.
at midnight. Or this could mean me, you, Chelsea, Joanna, Chris, Kim, whoever. We're all hanging out, New Year's Eve celebration. It's New Year's Eve. New Year's Eve, 12 o'clock. Let's pass the port, as in port wine, at midnight. Okay? So again, the word port is lexically ambiguous in the context of that sentence, which is exactly the next term we want to bring up, context. And context is the circumstances and discourse that determines the meanings of words and sentences. So again, if I'm throwing the Frisbee, I saw you duck, but that could mean you got a pet duck and you're walking around the lovely streets of Toronto, Canada, with a pet duck, which would be a bit crazy, but stranger things have happened.
I'd do it.
I know. So there's also another type of ambiguity that you see happen quite a bit, and it's called syntactic ambiguity, which gets a little bit deeper. And now, this is when you have a particular phrase in a sentence or an entire sentence that is completely ambiguous and without context. So let's say me and you, we go out to dinner one night and you're like, hey, Kat, could you call me an Uber? I gotta go home. Get on your iPhone, dial up my phone. Let's say my phone died. Dial up an Uber. That, I'd go home. But let's say I would just say, call me an Uber. I didn't call your name. I just said, call me an Uber. You could respond to me, and this would technically be correct, and just respond to me by saying Uber, because you said, call me an Uber. I mean, you didn't say, call me an Uber so I could get home. I've had a bit too much to drink. Just call me an Uber. So again, syntactically ambiguous. So you need context to set that up. Another example that I vividly remember from graduate school is the fish is ready to eat.
Yeah, weird.
Right, but think about that. That could be, let's say you and I go out to dinner one night. We're like, yo, I'm gonna eat some nice salmon. The fish is ready to eat. It's on the plate. We got this grilled asparagus on this side. We got the Yukon Gold potatoes. We're ready to go.
Yeah,
we're ready to go. But this could also mean you have an aquarium in your apartment and you got some goldfish and they're hungry and they're looking for you to drop those goldfish flakes in the water because the fish are ready to eat. They're hungry and they're ready to eat. So again, context matters when you're dealing with polysemics, when you're dealing with lexical ambiguity, and when you're dealing with syntactic ambiguity.
I love that. That's so interesting to sort of have these thought experiments happening. And I love the examples you were providing. So thank you for that. That's so interesting.
You're very welcome.
Go
ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I find this so fascinating because, I mean, I write, I'm in academia, whatever, but I don't often think about these things, and it's easy to take advantage of, all of the stuff we know and have learned through the years of just being alive and going to school and things like that. So I just wanted to, I just wanted to send appreciation for this because it is super interesting. And even if we're not often, thinking about these things, it comes to mind when you're thinking about talking to someone that doesn't speak the same language as you. And so I love that that's an aspect of this. One thing that I just thought of was something we could talk about another time, maybe, because we're running out of time, but
We've got about 8 minutes left.
things like in the cultural aspects of language, like we have English, but we have all sorts of different kinds of language, including AAVE, which is African American Vernacular English.
Correct.
And because we talk about racial justice all the time, we could have a conversation about how this language came about, how it's perpetuated, how it, new words are always being added to it, and we could also have a conversation about appropriation of a lot a lot too, because it's
perfect future episode.
Yeah, it's often appropriated and adopted in the wider culture, but it often is coming from things like hip hop music. So
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely, and and part of the reason why we wanted to do this conversation is so that we are communicating more clearly on a day-to-day basis, and not just interlingually with people who don't necessarily speak English as their mother tongue, but intralingually.
Yeah.
Because there are some people who may not necessarily have the same literacy as you that might be like, hey, you know what? I don't understand this big word or this phrase. So you don't necessarily want to dumb down your discourse, but you want to simplify it to the point where they're able to understand, because that is the very basis of communication. It's the transfer of meaning and understanding of meaning. Because if the recipient doesn't understand what you're saying, you haven't really communicated to that person at all. You haven't communicated to them. And part of what we wanted to do is close out this episode with, there are 13 phrases, and I saw this a while back, and I was like, I'm going to hold on to these because these are important, that we want to try to communicate to people on a more often. Because again, we want to make sure that we're communicating with people clearly, but we also, part of what we say at the end of every show is, we do this because we care. We care about each of you. Okay? We say that and we mean it. Yeah. And there are 13 phrases that I forget where I saw them, but I saved them on my phone. I wrote them down and wanted to share these phrases with everybody because they're important. Phrases like, I believe in you and I'm proud of you. I'm thinking of you. I love you. I knew you could do it. I hear you. I'm listening. Tell me more. Are you okay? Can I sit next to you? How do you feel? Do you need help? And hello. When we talk about being a better accountability partner, and we talk about what we say at the end of every show, where we do this because we care, these kind of phrases are rooted in like being an accountability partner. These kind of phrases are rooted in sharing is caring, and we do this because we care. These kind of phrases now more than ever are the types of phrases and the types of intentions that I think we need to be using more often, because there's a lot of people out here who are struggling. Yeah. There's a lot of people who are dealing with, as one of my favorite wrestlers of all time, Dusty Rhodes, he once said, we're dealing with hard times. And there are people out here who don't feel that their voice is being heard, and they feel like they're not being listened to. There are people who don't think they can do it, but they need encouragement. They need to hear, you know what, I can do it. There are people who feel isolated. They've been in quarantine for 5.5 months and haven't seen anybody. And a simple hello, how you doing? You okay? Do you need any help? All right. There's somebody that's been working on a master's degree for 2.5 years and they're like, man, I don't know if I can make it, but they finished, they graduated. Encourage them. Yeah, I know you could do it. It was hard, but I knew you could do it.
Yeah, tell people that you're proud of them for what they're doing, even if it is just getting up in the morning and making a coffee or a beverage or drinking some water. But these sentiments are so powerful and they seem so simple, but they really are just incredibly encouraging. And I'm so glad that we are going to end this episode on this topic because it is so important. And I'm glad you also brought up accountability, because we do have to encourage community care. I mean, that's my biggest thing. I talk about community constantly. That's what my all of my research has been about or involving. And I truly believe that community, no matter if it, your community is, 4 pen pals over the internet, or, your neighbors, your immediate neighbors, or, you're scattered across a city, your community is so important. And so,
or the country,
yeah,
or the
exactly.
world.
The world, yeah. You could be anywhere and have community. And these 13 life-saving statements can really save lives. Those things communicate that you care about whoever it is you're asking or stating these things to. So
yeah, it's important. And again, the phrases that we use when we talk about anti-racism, I'm saying, hey, you know what? We capitalize the B in Black. We capitalize the W in white. We don't say minority. We say underrepresented, because there's nothing minor about a human being. All right?
Exactly.
We don't say microaggression. In the Dr. Ibram Kennedy's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he said this. He said there's nothing micro or small about an aggression or racist abuse. Don't sanitize the terminology, the term microaggression. Call it what it actually is. It is racist abuse. That's what it is. When we talk about supporting people, you don't say, oh, you'll be fine, you'll be okay. No, how can I help you? You don't say, you know what, don't worry, you'll be okay. No, just let them know, hey, I don't have much, but I've got your back. If you need something, I've got you. You always see me at the end of my videos. If you want it, I've got it. If you need it, I can get it to you.
Yeah.
All right. And I don't say that just because it sounds cool and it rolls off the tongue easy. I legitimately mean that.
Yeah.
Don't dismiss somebody's struggles by saying, fuck it, that's no big deal. No. Acknowledge somebody else's struggle and somebody else's difficulty in their particular journey through life. Prince, years ago, and God knows I love Prince. I got a Prince tattoo. In the beginning of the song Purple Rain, he said, dearly beloved, we are gathered here to get through this thing called life. And he said, we are gathered here to get through this thing called life. We, not I. We meaning community. Community. Malcolm X, years ago, he said, if you change the I to we, illness becomes wellness. I'm going to say that again because that might have gone over some people's heads. If you change the I to a we, illness becomes wellness.
That's great.
So that's why we do these shows. That's why we decided to have a complete 60-minute chat on the Joe and Kat Chat series about language. Because again, words can harm, words can heal, words can hurt, words can help. And we're going to try to make sure that we all try to use a concerted effort to use words that heal and help rather than words that harm and hurt.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I think that's like the perfect place to stop because that was just so eloquent. Thank you so much, Joe. This was so both interesting. I learned a lot or was reminded, I guess, of a lot of things. But I'm just so glad we are ending on that note because that is truly what the intention is behind these chats. So Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Absolutely. By the way, Ms. Wells, what do we have for next week?
Oh, next week. What are we doing? Next week is, we're going to talk about the election. It's upcoming. So we're going to talk about elections in general. Yes. And the USA election 2020, Trump versus Biden. We're going to get into it deep and I'm going to bring a Canadian perspective, but yeah, that's it.
Awesome. All right. I think that's it for us. Kat Wells, have a wonderful day. You are the best and you are awesome with a capital A, and I mean that sincerely.
Same. Thanks. Bye.